Somewhere beneath the city of Isfahan in central Iran, there is close to 1,000 pounds of nuclear material that the United States government believes it can no longer see. Not believes is destroyed, not believes is gone, believes it cannot see. That distinction is the entire story, and it's the reason a plan landed on the Resolute desk earlier this year calling for American commandos to fly into the country, dig through hundreds of feet of rock, and physically carry that material out by hand. This is not a hypothetical. This is not a screenwriter's pitch. According to the Washington Post, citing two people with direct knowledge of the matter, the U.S. military presented Donald Trump with an actual operational plan to seize nearly 1,000 pounds of highly enriched uranium inside Iran. It would have involved flying excavation equipment into hostile territory and building a functioning airstrip so cargo planes could haul the radioactive material back out. That's not a raid. That's closer to a wartime construction project, defended by some of the most highly trained soldiers on the planet, conducted under fire, in a country that had just been at war with the United States and Israel. And the man who reviewed that plan turned it down. Before we get into how close this came to happening, it's worth being precise about what triggered it, because the backstory here matters as much as the mission itself. In June of 2025, the United States and Israel struck Iran's nuclear infrastructure in a campaign the Pentagon called Operation Midnight Hammer. B-2 Spirit bombers dropped bunker-buster munitions on the deeply buried facilities at Fordo. The USS Georgia, a guided missile submarine, contributed strikes of its own. Israeli and American officials at the time described the damage in sweeping terms. The program was obliterated, they said. But American intelligence assessments reported by CNN told a more complicated story. The strikes hadn't destroyed Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium so much as buried it, sealed it under rubble, under collapsed tunnels, under hundreds of feet of Iranian rock, at facilities spread mainly across three sites: Isfahan, Natanz, and Fordo. That distinction, obliterated versus buried, is what set the next year of American military planning in motion. Iran's own government, for what it's worth, has echoed part of that account. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, stated in March that the country's enriched uranium sits under the rubble left by last year's strikes, and that Tehran has no plan to recover it. Whether that's a genuine assessment or a diplomatic hedge is one of the open questions we'll come back to, but it lines up with what American officials have been saying privately for months. The material is very likely still there. It just isn't verifiably accounted for. And not verifiably accounted for is doing a lot of work in that sentence. According to the International Atomic Energy Agency's most recent reporting, reviewed by the Associated Press, the UN's nuclear watchdog has not been able to verify the status of Iran's near-weapons-grade uranium stockpile since the strikes last June. Iran cut off inspector access to the affected sites in late February of this year. Surveillance cameras were disabled, safeguard seals were removed. The IAEA has publicly stated that it lost what it calls continuity of knowledge regarding the material, a technical term with a very blunt meaning. Nobody outside Iran's government can currently confirm where this uranium is, how much of it survived the strikes intact, or what condition it's in. The agency's own Director General, Rafael Grossi, has said there is no evidence Iran is actively building a weapon, but that the size of the stockpile and Iran's refusal to grant full access remain, in his words, cause for serious concern. He's also said, more pointedly, that until Iran assists the agency in resolving its outstanding safeguards questions, the IAEA will not be in a position to assure the world that Iran's nuclear program is exclusively peaceful, which is about as close as the head of the UN's nuclear watchdog gets to saying, publicly, that the international community is currently flying blind on this specific question. The IAEA's own damage assessment, released after last year's strikes, adds useful texture here too. At Natanz, the agency found that the above-ground portion of the pilot fuel enrichment plant was destroyed outright, and assessed that a resulting loss of power may have caused additional unconfirmed damage to the enrichment halls buried underground. At Isfahan, inspectors confirmed damage to the site's chemical laboratory, its uranium conversion plant, a reactor fuel manufacturing facility, and the specific plant that processes enriched uranium into metal form, a facility of particular concern, since converting enriched uranium into metal is one of the final steps toward a weapon. None of that confirms the uranium itself was destroyed. It confirms the infrastructure around it was heavily damaged, which is precisely why American planners couldn't simply assume the problem had solved itself. Under Iran's own safeguards agreement with the IAEA, the country is obligated to file what's called a special report following events like this, one detailing the exact location and condition of its nuclear material after any attack or comparable incident. Iran has not filed one. According to the agency's own account, Tehran informed the IAEA in a letter this past November that any further cooperation was conditional on approval from Iran's Supreme National Security Council. effectively making continued nuclear transparency a political decision for Iran's leadership to make or withhold, rather than a standing legal obligation the country is simply fulfilling. That's the backdrop against which we can't verify the uranium is still there has to be understood. It's not that inspectors looked and found nothing. It's that Iran has not let them look at all. So picture the position the American government found itself in by early this year. A war had ended, or paused, depending on who you ask. Iran's above-ground enrichment infrastructure was in ruins, but the raw material, the actual highly enriched uranium, the thing every centrifuge and every facility exists to produce, was still down there, somewhere. Unverified, undestroyed. And according to the IAEA's own math, more than substantial enough to matter. As of this summer, the agency's estimate for Iran's stockpile of uranium enriched up to 60% sits at 440. 9 kilograms, sufficient, if further enriched to weapons grade, for something in the range of 10 nuclear devices. There's an additional 184 kilograms enriched to 20% on top of that. That's the arithmetic that pushed the uranium question from a diplomatic footnote to the center of the war's endgame. And it's the arithmetic that led eventually to a plan involving American Special Operations Forces on the ground inside Iran. If this story feels familiar in outline, American commandos, a hostile country, a high-value target buried out of reach, it's because the U.S. military has been here before, and it did not go well the first time. In 1980, President Jimmy Carter authorized Operation Eagle Claw, an attempt to rescue 52 American hostages held at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. The mission collapsed in the desert before troops ever reached the city. A sandstorm, mechanical failures, a helicopter colliding with a transport plane, 8 American servicemen killed, and a humiliating failure broadcast to the entire world. Eagle Claw is the reason the Pentagon created Joint Special Operations Command in the years that followed, pulling Delta Force, Navy SEAL Team 6, and Air Force Special Tactics units into one coordinated structure, specifically so a disaster like that would never happen again. 46 years later, according to Trump's own public remarks, that history was sitting in the room when this new plan was briefed to him. It's worth pausing on just how deeply that failure shaped everything that followed in American Special Operations, because it's the direct institutional ancestor of the units that would have carried out this new mission. Eagle Claw failed for reasons that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with coordination. The Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine elements involved had never trained together as an integrated force. Communications broke down between services, and a helicopter shortage forced commanders to abort mid-mission before the collision at the staging site, known as Desert 1, killed 8 servicemen and ended the operation in flames on live television. The creation of Joint Special Operations Command afterward was a direct response, a permanent standing structure meant to ensure that Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, and the Air Force's Special Tactics units could plan and execute together seamlessly, rather than being assembled ad hoc under pressure. That command structure is precisely what would have been running this new Iran mission, more than 4 decades after the failure that created it. Here's how close it came to happening. CNN reported, citing sources familiar with the matter, that a senior American general secretly traveled to CENTCOM headquarters in Florida last month specifically for a private briefing on the plan, a ground mission to forcibly seize the enriched material. Around the same time, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, was in Brussels meeting with NATO officials. Sources told CNN the urgency and secrecy of the activity suggested the administration had come very close to actually approving the operation. One source familiar with the plan described it plainly. It would have involved a lot of risk. That source added that it wasn't surprising Trump ultimately chose not to greenlight it. So what would the mission itself have actually looked like mechanically if it had gone forward? This is where the reporting gets genuinely remarkable, and it's worth slowing down on the details, because they explain exactly why senior officials were split on whether this was even feasible. Start with the terrain problem. The uranium sits, according to American and Israeli intelligence assessments cited by Sandbox News, buried deep beneath the Isfahan, Fordo, and Natanz facilities. The same 3 sites hit by B-2 bombers and submarine-launched strikes last summer. This isn't material sitting in a warehouse. It's under hardened rock, hundreds of feet down, in tunnel networks specifically engineered by Iran's own nuclear program to survive exactly the kind of airstrikes that were used against them. And in the aftermath of those strikes, Iranian forces reportedly reinforced the site further, fortifying entrances with dirt embankments and roadblocks, a signal to American analysts that Tehran anticipated exactly this kind of follow-up operation. Then there's the distance problem. According to CBS News, of the special operations units involved, highly specialized elements of Delta Force specifically trained in what the military calls rendering safe nuclear materials would most likely have had to launch from Navy ships in the Arabian Sea, nearly 1,000 miles from the target. An alternative would be launching from Kuwait or eastern Iraq, a shorter but still substantial distance. Either way, operators would likely need to establish a forward staging ground miles from the objective, just to begin the operation, all while trying to preserve the element of surprise in hostile territory. Then there's the extraction problem, and this is the part that turns a raid into something closer to a military engineering campaign. You cannot simply grab several hundred pounds of uranium hexafluoride and sprint back to a helicopter. According to the Washington Post's reporting, the plan briefed to Trump involved flying an actual excavation equipment and constructing a functional airstrip inside hostile Iranian territory so that cargo aircraft could land, load the material, and fly it out. Sandbox News adds that special operations, fixed-wing and rotary-wing aircraft would be needed simply to evacuate the material once it was recovered. This is not a snatch and grab. This is building temporary infrastructure under fire deep inside a country the United States had just been at war with. One retired official put the scale of this in blunt terms. Mick Mulroy, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense and a retired CIA and Marine Corps officer, told the Washington Post that this would be, quote, one of, if not the largest, most complicated special operations in history, adding that it represented a major risk to the force. Some reporting has pushed the scale of the proposed operation even further, though it's worth flagging clearly that this particular detail is less firmly sourced than the rest. The Daily Mirror, citing 2 unnamed British military sources, reported that the plan under consideration involved a massive helicopter-borne insertion of thousands of assault troops supporting a large contingent of Delta Force operators, an operation the paper's sources estimated could take at least 24 hours to execute, aimed at recovering roughly 450 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium. One of those sources described the plan's risk of casualties as very high, suggesting it may have been judged too difficult even before it reached the president's desk. Take that specific figure, thousands of troops, a full day of operations, as a single unverified account layered on top of the more solidly sourced core reporting from the Washington Post and CNN. It illustrates the scale some planners were discussing. It is not confirmed as the final version of what was actually briefed to Trump. What is confirmed directly from the president himself is what happened next. On June 4th of this year, speaking to reporters at the White House, Trump confirmed that he had personally considered sending American Special Operations Forces into Iran to retrieve the uranium, and that he had turned it down. His reasoning, in his own words, centered on exactly the historical shadow we mentioned earlier. I didn't want to be Jimmy Carter, he told reporters, according to Iran International. I didn't feel like being Jimmy Carter, so that topic we thought about it right at the very beginning before we did what we did, before we destroyed their entire military. We thought about it, and I didn't want to be in a position where you're in a war zone. According to the Times of Israel's live coverage of those same remarks, Trump elaborated further, describing the plan as something that would have required a minimum of 2 weeks inside Iranian territory, and framing it as an unnecessary escalation given the alternative paths available. It's entombed, he said of the uranium, arguing that the U.S. did not need to physically retrieve it at that moment, though he left the door open to doing so later, either through a negotiated agreement with Tehran, or, failing that, through force. That last part is worth sitting with, because it means this story is not actually closed. In an interview with NBC News' Meet the Press days later on June 7th, Trump laid out what amounted to 2 competing paths forward. One involved cooperation. If we make a deal that now we're friendly, we'll all go together, he said. It'll be our equipment. We'll take it out and destroy it, whether it's on site or whether we take it off site, and we will go with them or without them. But we won't have people shooting at us, okay? The other path was blunter. Now, if we don't make a deal, he said, then we're going to take them out militarily very harshly. In other words, the commando option wasn't permanently shelved. It was paused, pending negotiations, and if those negotiations collapse, the same category of operation, or something like it, remains on the table. So where does that leave things right now, as of the most current reporting available? This is where the freshest layer of the story comes in, and it's less settled than you might expect. According to a daily military tracking report published August 3rd, the broader Iran conflict remains in an unresolved cancel and reschedule holding pattern. Trump announced on his Truth Social platform that he was canceling a threatened multi-day air campaign against Iran, stating the U.S. remained, in his words, locked and loaded, but that Iran and other regional states had asked for time because the perimeters of a deal had reportedly been reached. Trump specified that any final agreement would need to include the full reopening of the Strait of Hormuz and what he called an end to Iran's nuclear threat. As of this reporting, that deal has not been finalized, and the cancellation of further strikes was explicitly described as conditional. Layer that on top of what we already know about the uranium itself, and the picture becomes clear. Nobody outside of Iran's government currently knows the true status of that stockpile. Not with certainty. The IAEA has publicly stated it cannot confirm whether the material survived last year's strikes in a usable state, whether it's been moved or whether it's been altered in any way, because Iran has refused inspectors access to the relevant sites since February. Some open-source tracking estimates place Iran's pre-strike total stockpile at approximately 5,800 kilograms across various enrichment levels, with roughly 2,600 kilograms assessed as destroyed in the strikes, leaving somewhere in the range of 3,200 kilograms of material, whose exact condition remains functionally a black box. It helps to understand how Iran's stockpile got large enough to matter this much in the first place, because the scale of it didn't happen overnight. Under the original 2015 nuclear agreement, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, Iran was restricted to enriching uranium no higher than 67%, a level suitable for civilian power reactors, nowhere near weapons usable, and capped at a stockpile of just 202 kilograms, according to the Arms Control Association. Under those limits, experts calculated Iran would have needed roughly a year to produce enough weapons-grade material for a single bomb. The United States withdrew from that agreement in 2018. Iran began breaching its own limits the following year, and from there, the numbers climbed steadily, enrichment levels rising to 20%, then to 60%, a level with essentially no civilian application and only a short technical step away from weapons grade, while Tehran deployed more advanced centrifuges that could produce that material faster. By late 2024, according to the Arms Control Association's assessment, Iran's breakout timeline for a single weapon had shrunk to less than 2 weeks. That's the trajectory that turned Iran's uranium stockpile from a diplomatic talking point into the specific, urgent, quantifiable problem that a president was being briefed on inside the Situation Room this year. That's the strange, unresolved center of this entire story. The United States built and seriously considered executing one of the most ambitious special operations missions in modern military history. Helicopters, excavation crews, a temporary airstrip inside hostile territory, JSOC's most elite operators, specifically to solve a problem that, as of today, still hasn't been solved by any other means either. The uranium hasn't been destroyed. It hasn't been recovered. It hasn't even been reliably located by anyone outside Tehran. It's just sitting there, buried, unaccounted for, while the diplomatic and military tracks both continue to circle it. It's also worth being honest about why a plan this audacious even reached a president's desk in the first place. Because the answer isn't purely tactical, it's institutional. Sandbox News reports that Delta Force has specifically trained for missions like this since the 1990s, under a category the military calls Hardened Deeply Buried Target Operations, or HDET for short. That training program exists because American planners recognized decades ago that future adversaries would move their most valuable military and strategic assets deep underground, specifically to put them beyond the reach of airstrikes. Iran's nuclear program, dug into mountainsides at Fordo and reinforced with hundreds of feet of rock at Natanz and Isfahan, is close to a textbook example of exactly the scenario that training was designed for. In other words, this wasn't a plan improvised on the fly in response to a single crisis. It drew on decades of standing doctrine built for precisely this kind of target, and that raises the uncomfortable question underneath the entire operation. Even with all of that training, all of that doctrine, all of that institutional preparation, was this ever actually going to work? CBS News' reporting suggests the honest military answer is maybe, but at extraordinary cost. The report describes the operation as potentially one of the riskiest missions in modern history, not because American special operators lack the skill, but because of pure physics and geography. A target buried under solid rock, hundreds of miles from any friendly staging point, inside a country whose military had just spent weeks at war with the forces trying to extract that material. Every added layer of complexity, the excavation equipment, the temporary runway, the fixed-wing extraction, is also an added layer of exposure. More time on the ground means more opportunity for Iranian forces, IRGC units, or proxy fighters to locate, surround, or strike the operation before it could complete its objective and get out. There's a broader political and human backdrop to all of this inside Iran as well, one that shapes why officials in Tehran would have been especially alert to any hint of an American incursion. Iran's judiciary has carried out a wave of public executions in the past year, alongside mass detentions, forced confessions, and expanded domestic surveillance, a crackdown widely understood by regional analysts as the regime tightening internal control in the aftermath of last year's war. The hardline factions within Iran's government, particularly the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, have reportedly consolidated authority further during this period and have specifically increased security measures around nuclear sites and other critical infrastructure. Raid one way, that's simply wartime paranoia. Raid another way, and this is the reading American planners would have had to take seriously, it's evidence that Tehran anticipated exactly the kind of operation being discussed in Washington and prepared accordingly. Either way, it meant any American mission into that territory would not be walking into a passive or undefended environment. The debate inside the United States itself, meanwhile, was never close to unanimous either, and it split in ways that didn't track neatly along party lines. Republican Representative Pat Fallon of Texas told CBS News he fully supported the administration's broader military campaign against Iran, arguing that any future agreement with Tehran would need to include, in his words, complete, open, unfettered access for international inspectors, because Iran's government could not otherwise be trusted to comply. On the other end of the spectrum, some lawmakers pushed back hard enough on the underlying use of force that Democratic Representative Al Green of Texas filed a resolution to impeach the president over the earlier strikes, a sign of just how divisive the broader campaign had become, even before the uranium recovery plan specifically reached Trump's desk. That division matters for understanding why this plan didn't simply get rubber-stamped once it was written up. It landed in Washington at a moment when there was no political consensus on how much further military risk in Iran was actually worth taking, uranium or no uranium. It's also worth understanding that this uranium plan didn't emerge in a political vacuum. Reporting from Axios, cited by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, indicates that early in the conflict, the Pentagon was already developing a menu of options for what it internally described as a final blow against Iran, a menu that reportedly ranged from a massive bombing campaign to the use of ground forces, to deep operations aimed at reopening the Strait of Hormuz and, specifically, securing the buried, enriched uranium. According to that same reporting, some officials inside the administration viewed an overwhelming show of force less as a military necessity and more as a way to generate leverage in negotiations, or simply to hand the president a clean, dramatic way to declare the conflict over. That's a meaningfully different framing than surgical recovery mission. It suggests the uranium raid was, for at least some planners, one tool among several being weighed for its political value as much as its technical necessity. Congress, for its part, was anything but unified on any of this. Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chairman James Risch, a Republican from Idaho, told reporters there were, in his words, a number of plans that have been put on the table to deal with the enriched uranium, projecting confidence that the administration had this handled. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer struck a very different tone, stating publicly that Iran must never be allowed to attain a nuclear weapon, while also warning that the American people do not want another endless and costly war in the Middle East when there are so many problems at home, and criticizing the administration for what he called a failure to provide Congress with sufficient detail on the scope of the threat. PBS News reported that lawmakers and outside experts share a specific, deeper worry underneath this entire debate, that if Iran's hardliners consolidate power in the aftermath of last year's strikes, they may emerge even more motivated to weaponize what remains of the stockpile, specifically as a deterrent against future American or Israeli action. That dynamic, a wounded, hardened regime with a decreasing incentive to cooperate, is part of what made the uranium's exact location and condition feel urgent enough to seriously consider sending American operators into the country to physically go get it. If you've been tracking this channel's coverage of the broader Iran conflict, this uranium question ties directly back into stories we've covered before, about the strikes themselves and the diplomatic maneuvering that followed. And it's the kind of story where staying subscribed genuinely helps because the facts here are still shifting week to week, not settled once and forgotten. There's also a wrinkle in the regional picture worth mentioning, though it comes with its own separate sourcing question. Iran International has reported that Israeli media outlets, specifically Ynet, previously described a separate covert effort involving Kurdish Iranian opposition groups being armed by Israeli and American intelligence services as part of a broader push toward pressuring the Iranian government, a plan that reports said was ultimately shelved under pressure from Turkey. Multiple Kurdish opposition figures, including the Secretary General of the Komala Party of Iranian Kurdistan, have specifically denied receiving any such weapons from Israel or the United States. That story runs parallel to the uranium operation, not directly connected to it, and it remains contested and only partially confirmed, but it's a useful reminder that the uranium plan didn't exist in isolation. It sat inside a much wider web of covert and semi-covert options that were reportedly on the table throughout this conflict. So, pulling all of this together, what do we actually know, and where does genuine uncertainty remain? We know from the Washington Post's sourced reporting that a detailed operational plan to seize Iran's highly enriched uranium was formally briefed to President Trump this year, and that it involved excavation equipment and the construction of a runway inside Iranian territory. We know from CNN's reporting that senior military leadership treated this plan with real urgency, including a secret briefing at CENTCOM headquarters, and that the administration came close to approving it. We know, directly from Trump's own on-the-record remarks in June, that he ultimately rejected the plan, citing the historical shadow of Operation Eagle Claw and the risks of an extended ground presence inside a war zone. We know from the IAEA's own reporting via the Associated Press that the international community currently has no verified picture of where this uranium is or what condition it's in, because Iran has refused inspector access since February. And we know from the most recent tracking available as of early August that the broader military and diplomatic standoff over this exact material remains unresolved, with strikes threatened, paused, and conditioned on a deal that has not yet been finalized. What we don't know, and what remains genuinely contested, includes the precise scale of troop numbers some reports have attached to the plan. The Daily Mirror's account of a 1,000-strong helicopter assault rests on 2 unnamed British sources and hasn't been corroborated by American outlets. We don't know the exact current physical condition of the uranium itself. Even Iran's own government has offered only a general claim that it lies under the rubble, which is not the same as a verified technical assessment. And we don't know whether the diplomatic path currently being pursued will actually hold, or whether this same commando option, shelved once for now, ends up back on a president's desk in the months ahead. That last point is really the honest ending to this story, because there isn't a clean one yet. This isn't a mission that succeeded gloriously or failed catastrophically, the way Eagle Claw did in 1980. It's a mission that was built, briefed, seriously considered, and then deliberately not launched, which, depending on how you look at it, might be either the most disciplined decision in this entire conflict, or simply a problem deferred rather than solved. Say what you want about the outcome, but if you've made it this far, it's worth sticking around for how this develops. The next update on Iran's uranium status is likely only weeks away, given how fast this situation has been moving all year, and this channel will be tracking it as it happens, which raises the actual question worth sitting with. If the diplomatic track collapses, if the perimeters of a deal Trump referenced don't hold, is a raid like this one ever genuinely survivable at the scale being described? Or is the far more honest assessment the one implied by Trump's own decision, that some targets, even ones this significant, are simply too costly to go in and physically take? That's a real judgment call, not a settled fact, and reasonable people inside the Pentagon itself were reportedly split on it. What do you think the right call actually was here? And if it comes back on the table, should it stay off it? Drop your read on it below, especially if you've got a background that gives you a different lens on the risk calculus than the headlines do. If reporting like this, sourced, careful, distinguishing what's confirmed from what's still contested, is the kind of coverage you want more of, that's exactly the kind of channel this is trying to be, and sticking around for the next one helps make that possible. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.